Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name's Alex, and I'm the technical manager for this session titled Addressing Food-Related Health Risks Within Informal and Food Environments in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. We have a great team of facilitators from a range of different institutions, as you can see, from World Fish, World Veg, International Livestock Research Institute, and University of Waterloo as well. I'd like to thank you so much for taking a part in ANH 2026. This is our first session of an entire week of learning labs, which you can see on our website, and I'll post a link to that in the chat in a second. We're really excited for this session today. It should be very interactive, robust, and I hope you learn, a lot from these great team of facilitators. Before the team takes the conversation forward, I have a few technical announcements just to ensure our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible today. First, this session will be recorded and posted to the ANH Academy website before the end of this conference. Second, all participants have been muted upon entry, but we encourage you to introduce yourselves using the chat feature. You can just say your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization you support. We encourage you to share your video if your bandwidth allows. And if you have any questions, we invite you to share them in the chat throughout the session. And last, if at any point you experience any technical issues, please check your audio settings, internet connection, and you can always try to rejoin the session using the same Zoom link you used prior. You can also send me a private Zoom chat if you need any extra support. So thanks so much, and now we'll turn it over to the facilitation team to kick us forward.
Yeah, thank you, Alex, and thank you again to the ANH team for this opportunity to discuss this important topic on food-related health risks. I'll just ask Kebede to go into the introduction slides just for me to add something around the introduction. Possibly what I'd say, Alex has already introduced who the speakers are, and you've seen the range of institutions, but all the thing that brings us together is a common interest in food-related health risks, and specifically on food safety on One Health. Maybe I'll talk a bit about how the structure of the presentation will be or the learning labs will be. So what will happen is we'll have a short introduction, and then we'll follow 3 value chains and look at the specific food-related health risks we expect. And then we'll talk about measurement and what potential solutions are. And in the end, there'll be an opportunity for Q&A. What we also request is that if you have any questions along the way as we present, you can just post them in the chat, and whoever has presented, should they have an opportunity to see them, will respond to them, or the person that question is directed to, if you indicate, will respond to. In case that is not done, Ilana will have a Q&A at the end where she'll go back to these questions and make sure they're responded to. And should you feel that maybe you would want a further discussion within the time, just, you'll lift up your hand or whatever means that to indicate that you would want to unmute your mic and have a discussion on it. What we are hoping in this session is that we'll continue to raise interest in working in the area around food safety and food-related health risks, and that you will also we will continue to emphasize the importance of working in an interdisciplinary manner and promoting the approach of One Health to be able to do this in these 3 value chains. So we'll go to the next slide, please. And what we will do first, we just want to see where you are at in terms of your knowledge of the topic and so on. So we start with a poll. And this is a Menti poll. And if you check your charts, there should be a link or a code or a QR code that you should be able to scan if you're using your phone near you to be able to answer this question. And the first question we have is, when you hear the term informal food environments, what is the first thing that comes to mind? And we're asking this question because we are talking about food-related health risks in the context of informal food environments. So I hope the link or the QR code has been posted, Kebede, and people can be able to access this. Oh, okay, Joe has sent it. So there's a code there and there's a link. Just click on it and just tell us the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about informal food environments. Just to let you know, as you begin to respond, that we tried it among ourselves when we were preparing, and there were some, even among us, there were some very interesting responses. And if you have trouble getting into the link, just let us know. And I'm waiting for I'm not seeing any response so far. I'm waiting to see what people think about what informal food environments are. The QR code is not showing. If the QR code is not showing, there's a link there that is in the chat. Dr. Ebenezer, if you just click on the link that has just been sent by Joe in the chat box, and you should be able to. So Kebede, I see someone saying they submitted a response. On my end, I don't see any response. Several responses. So, okay. As okay, now I see good. Now I see the responses. I was beginning to going to tell people to unmute and tell us. Okay, so I see street food unregulated. I'm happy. I'm happy about the responses I am seeing. Unregulated. I'm seeing a lot of street vendors coming up, food stalls, roadside kiosks, fresh markets, stigma. Wow. Okay, stigma. Ilana possibly will handle that. Food insecurity, informal markets. I guess I mean maybe informal settlements and so on. Someone needs to mute. Okay, yeah. So I think as the responses come in, I think the common thing around informal food environments, which include informal markets, is that they are unregulated. I think that's the common thing that we pick up from, and it has come up from these responses. So they are outside the formal regulation structures. So, for example, when you think about a supermarket and so on, where you can easily track safety or how things are handled, this is not the case with informal food environments. And we will go to the next poll, please. And the next poll is very similar. And this one, we want you to make a guess, or possibly you already know, what proportion of foods consumed is obtained through the informal food environments in Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia? What proportion of food do you think? And I'm beginning to see that a lot of you say more than 60%. Okay, more than 60%. And what I'll begin to say is that we know that a large segment of especially urban population, more than half of urban populations in Sub-Saharan and Southeast Asia do obtain their daily food from informal food markets. And it's all kinds of things. It's fruits, it's vegetables, it's the nutrient-dense foods, but it is also the highly processed forms. And therefore, informal food markets become very important, especially when you think about the rapid urbanization that is happening, that is causing changes in the way people are accessing and acquiring foods. And a lot of people are sourcing foods from these markets because of their accessibility and their affordability. They're often very near where they live, so it's convenient to shop there. But also the food in these markets is affordable. Many times affordable because also the portions in which the food is sold can be accessed by the groups of people that are buying, but also when this food has not gone through the formal channels, the food has, for example, not gone through the taxation procedures and so on, and is not as costly. And so most people are sourcing food from these environments. I think we will now go to the next slide after this. Yeah. And so while we talk about informal markets, and specifically for our presentation, we talk about informal markets and food-related health risks of nutrient-dense perishable foods. We know that, for example, in Southeast Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa particularly, we do have issues with micronutrient deficiencies of especially vulnerable groups. These are women and children, and specifically women of reproductive age and children and adolescents. And therefore, these people need to access nutritious foods. Most of the time, these nutritious foods, nutrient-dense foods, are perishable, but they're also affordable and accessible only in these informal markets, or mostly in these informal markets. And therefore, informal markets become an important source of these foods, but also an important place where food safety and food-related health risks have to be thought about. Next slide, please. When we talk about informal food environments, like I said at the beginning, you see the pictures there. It's, the main issue is about the regulation of these markets. I think I saw in the word cloud that, many times when people think about informal food markets, they think that in their appearance, they will always look not clean. Let me use that word. But you see from our pictures, and we've intentionally chose them, when you think about food related health risks and food safety, it's not always things you can see with your bare eyes. And this will come up when we do the specific presentations. When you look at the fruit and veg there, I personally want to eat the purpose that I'm seeing there. I'm not necessarily thinking that there's a food related health risk when I look at this. When you look at that fish market in Southeast Asia, seemingly the seafood you see there, the fish you see there really does look, there shouldn't be any food related health risk when you think about it. But is this so? And how can this be regulated in a way that this food remains accessible and still safe? Next slide, please. So informal food markets also, and remember I've gone from environments to markets. We are zeroing down to markets within the informal food environments, can be of different types. They can be open air, like the one you see for me on my left, possibly for you on your right. And this is a picture I took in Zanzibar where you see an open air informal food market, no form of regulation, but really looking appetizing. There were a lot of people around this stall. But they can also be roadside stalls, as you see on your left, or on a truck. They can be kiosks, it can be mobile vendors. So they do take different forms. In Sub-Saharan Africa, you might also see people by the side of the road roasting maize and things like that. They can be different kinds. But look at these pictures and ask yourself, for example, for the vendor there serving people, how do his hands look like? How is he moving between serving different customers, for example? Do you see any source of potable water around there and so on? And many times us as consumers ourselves, as we are shopping here, we are not necessarily looking at that. And so these are the issues that we're going to talk about. Why is it important? And we talk about this because food safety, as it relates to nutrition, is an important aspect of delivering nutritious foods. We often focus on how nutrient dense our diet is, the food on our plate is, but often forget about the safety and the health risks that are related to the safety of that food and therefore the impacts on nutrition. And so we'll go to the next slide. And we will begin in the next slide to introduce a journey in which we now begin looking at the specific value chains. And to kick us off before we go into the specific value chains, I'd like you to do the last poll and tell us, I see people are already voting, which perishable food, the milk, the vegetables, or the fish on this plates would you trust the least from an informal food environment? Oh, yeah, this is interesting. So it's the milk. I wish I could, yeah, ask one person to unmute and say why the milk. I expected different responses. It's interesting. It's the milk. I don't know if that's an indication that a lot of the people who have joined are working in this value chain, and that's why. But I hope Florence, who is online, who is going to talk about the milk value chain, will elaborate what these risks are in the milk, but also the ones who will talk about the vegetable and the fish will tell you why we need to also continue eating them, of course, but also continue thinking about the food safety and health related risks and why it's important to address this. Maybe this indicates the vegetable and the fish people need to also elaborate what the risks should be thought about. So Florence, Ilana, Richard, if you're online, you see these responses. And now I'll hand over to Ilana, who will take us on a journey of the vegetables you see on that plate and why maybe that score should be higher than 7. Over to you, Ilana.
All right. Thank you so much, Wanjiku. And yes, my name is Ilana Cliffer. I am, just to briefly introduce myself, I'm a food systems scientist at the World Vegetable Center. And so my job today is to talk about the vegetable part of this plate. So we're going to start with this amaranth that you see here that looks really delicious. It's now in the form of a stir fry, but it, of course, was not always in the form of a stir fry. So the question that the amaranth plate in the stir fry is asking you is, do you think that I'm safe to eat? And let's show you how the amaranth got to this plate, and then you can decide for yourself how safe this amaranth stir fry is. So let's go to the next slide. So the amaranth begins its journey on a small farm. And as happens often on farms, there's a lot of pest pressure from, in this case, from aphids, and that starts to worry the farmer. So if you were that farmer, so I'm going to present a few dilemmas about the different parts of the food system, that the vegetable goes through. And I want you to just think about, if you were in the place of in this case, the farmer, what would you do if you had pest pressure from aphids? So would you either apply chemical pesticides, or would you use poultry manure to try to get rid of the pest pressure? So just think about it for a minute, and then we can go through what would actually be the consequences of each of those choices. So if we move to the next slide, we can see that if you decided, okay, I'm going to, apply chemical pesticides to get rid of the pests, of course, you reduce the crop loss, but you, of course, also increase pesticide exposure and, to yourself as the farmer, and also increase the risk of passing on pesticide residues to the consumers who will consume the amaranth later on. However, if you use poultry manure instead, you will have fewer chemical inputs, and you would have lower production costs. But by using poultry manure, you could be increasing the heavy metal contamination in the soil and in the leaves of the amaranth. And you could also be introducing microbial contamination, depending on how well that poultry manure was prepared and treated. Okay, so that's what happens on the farm. Now let's see where the amaranth goes next. So also on the farm, the climate is changing, water is scarce, and it's very difficult for the amaranth to grow without enough water. So the leaves are starting to wilt. So now if you're the farmer again, would you irrigate with wastewater from a nearby canal, or would you reduce your irrigation and accept the fact that you might have lower yields? So just think about what you would do, and also feel free to put into the chat which answer you would choose if you are so inclined to do so. So let's see what would happen if you did each of those. Okay, so if you were to irrigate with wastewater from a nearby canal, of course you maintain your yield, and as the farmer, you maintain your income. And you actually reduce your fertilizer costs, as using wastewater can help with sort of a natural way of fertilizing the plants, but you might introduce pathogens and contaminants from that wastewater source if it's not treated correctly. However, if you reduce irrigation, then of course you're reducing your contamination risks, but you can decrease your yield most likely, and then your income as the farmer is not going to be as good, and then that might also be passed to the consumer in terms of increased prices to the consumer. Okay, so let's see now. So now from now the amaranth has grown on the farm and is ready to be transported to the market. But the market is several hours away and there's no paved road to get there. So if you're the transporter, how would you transport the amaranth? Would you use bundles that are stored in those reusable woven sacks that are quite common? Or would you use covered plastic crates that could increase your costs and reduce the quantity transported? So happy to see that some people are actually answering these questions in the chat. It's really nice to see. So let's see what would happen with each of these solutions to this problem. On the next slide. Okay, so if you decide as the farmer to use the bundles that are stored in the reusable woven sacks for your amaranth to get to the market, you would be keeping your transport costs low. You would be, probably transporting a much larger volume, but those sacks don't allow for a lot of airflow. They are difficult to wash, so when they get reused, they could be already contaminated with pathogens. So you could potentially be increasing the contamination of the amaranth and also damaging the leaves, causing spoilage because of the compression that the sacks compress the amaranth, and as I said, the lack of airflow. So, but if you choose B with covered plastic crates, of course, you would have a lower risk of contamination and you would be protecting the quality of your amaranth, but those crates can be expensive. The thing that you also consider is that when the crates go to the market, they have to come back to the farm, and usually they would come back to the farm empty. And so that's a whole nother transport trajectory that could be adding to your costs. And you have a lower storage capacity in the truck with those crates. So you might be vastly reducing your transport capacity. So that could impact your income as well. So let's move to the next. Okay, so for the next one, I did an actual poll. So the dilemma is now the amaranth has made it to the market. The informal market is very hot and there's no shade. So now put yourself in the place of the vendor. What would you decide to do? Would you sprinkle some water from a nearby water source that you're unsure of the water quality on the amaranth to keep it looking fresh? Or would you leave the amaranth untouched, but then of course risk that it might start to look wilted? So yeah, interesting, very interesting to see. I think that most people are putting themselves in the place of the vendor who, of course, would, if you're in this situation, would want to keep your amaranth looking fresh, and makes a lot of sense that you would want to do that as the vendor, to make sure that you would actually be able to sell your product. Yeah, this is great to see. All right, so maybe we move to the next slide. So if you chose A, which most of you, putting yourself in the place of the vendor, chose option A, you would be sprinkling water from a nearby tap, but you're not sure of the quality of that tap. So you're maintaining the look of freshness of the amaranth. You probably will sell more amaranth, but you might be introducing contamination to the amaranth if you have a poor water quality in the water that you're using to sprinkle on the amaranth. If you decide, okay, I want to leave the amaranth untouched as the vendor, you would be avoiding contaminating the amaranth, but then you might be reducing your sales and increasing waste if your vegetables are wilting. So difficult decisions to make in this informal market. And so let's move to the next decision point. So now the amaranth has been purchased, is in the household, and is ready to be prepared into that delicious looking stir fry, but first needs to be washed at the home. So in the home, the water source is a communal pump, and the water has been carried from that pump to the household and is stored in large bins. And maybe it's stored in those large bins for a few days at a time. So you could, if you're that consumer, who's using your stored water in your household to wash the amaranth, would you decide to soak the amaranth in a small basin of water from the household water bin before you cook it? Or would you decide to go to the water pump and rinse the amaranth several times using the fresh water directly from the pump and change your water in between rinses? So think about, if you're really in this situation, what would you actually do as the consumer? So of course, if you chose A, you would be using less water from your, you would be using of your less of the precious resource of water in your household. It's much quicker, it's much more convenient, but that stored water source might unfortunately have a high level of contamination with pathogens, and you could easily spread those pathogens to the vegetables as they're soaking in that water. However, if you chose B, of course, you would be more effectively removing the dirt and the contamination, but you would be using more water, which is a precious resource. You would be using a lot more of your time, and it would take a lot more of your effort to go back to the pump just for this reason to rinse your amaranth in that water. So those are the options in the household. So now the amaranth will be prepared into a stir fry, and I want to ask you, at what point for you did this amaranth become unsafe to eat? So maybe it became unsafe at the farm level or during transport or in the informal market or at the household, or maybe you would still, as the consumer, feel comfortable still eating the amaranth even after you're well informed of its entire journey. So seeing a few answers for the pest control. Yeah. Yeah, this is really interesting to see. And of course, there's no right answer here, but I think that the thing to think about is just that at every stage, of course, this was a demonstration of one particular vegetable, but it holds true for most vegetables in that at every point of the value chain and in the food system, there are really difficult choices that to be made that are not necessarily, it's not something that the individual who's making those choices can control in terms of food safety risks to some extent, because they're making choices based off of the infrastructure available to them. So yeah, I think this is really interesting to see how people are thinking about when this might have become unsafe to eat. And so let's move to the next slide, which is just to summarize. So as you saw, the food safety risks accumulate through the food system and through the value chain through the repeated handling and exposure as the produce is moving from the farm to the consumer. There was actually a study recently done on amaranth in particular that showed that they didn't measure at the household level, but they did measure contamination levels up until the retail level and found that the highest contamination levels were found in the informal retail market. So it's sort of evidence that these food safety risks are accumulating and just getting sort of more and more important as the food is moving through the value chain. So all of these decisions are really difficult decisions and trade-offs that the people at every level have to think about. So the farmer in this example was balancing yield and their own income against contamination risks. The traders and the transporters are balancing affordability against protection of the produce. The vendors are balancing freshness and consumer willingness to pay against hygiene, and the consumers themselves are balancing their own use of resources and time against food safety. So the solution, I think, lies in system solutions that we need to think about to increase food safety in the informal food environment. So this means safe water, improved low-cost post-harvest technologies that would be easily able to be uptaken by farmers, better market infrastructure, and then, of course, some level of consumer awareness, but keeping in mind that consumer awareness needs to stress also the importance of vegetables for a healthy diet, and not impart fear onto people for eating vegetables. And so I think I have one more poll, just thinking about those system solutions. If it's up to you and you are the decision maker, and you have a limited amount of funds, which solution would you want to invest in? Yeah, so lots of answers coming in, and I think a lot of people would want to invest in safe water, and I understand, and I think that all of these are worth investing in, but I think that I understand the sort of majority view towards safe water because in all of these examples that we talked about, water was one of the major limiting factors at every level of the food system. So I think that we can think about the cost effectiveness of all these different types of infrastructural changes that need to happen in our food systems and what would be the best bang for our buck in terms of really making changes that would allow for better food safety for vegetables. So thank you all for participating in this part of the presentation, and I will pass now back to Wanjiku for following the fish through the value chain.
Thank you, Ilana. So I am Wanjiku, not Richard, presenting on behalf of Richard, and I work for World Fish as a public health and nutrition impact area lead and senior scientist. So I think going to the next slide, I think the first things that I just want to pick up from based on what Ilana said, and I think those are keywords as we move along, is that food safety or food-related health risks that occur along the value chain are cumulative. They are happening at every point. And most of the times post-harvest or post-catch, you're measuring an accumulated risk or an accumulated food safety concern. I think the other keyword that she mentioned is thinking about trade-offs and thinking about, cost effectiveness. That I saw a comment in the section saying it looks like there's no way out. I want to say that with this work, what we're saying is we are not trying to present that there is no way out. What we're trying to present is that there are different challenges, as I will talk about, along the value chain, and that we are leading up to the importance of risk assessment, cost effectiveness, and so on to make decisions around solutions. But we first need to know where the risks are. So as we follow the fish, I am going to talk about the fish post-harvest. And for us in fisheries and aquaculture, post-harvest is post-catch. So when the fish is landed at the beach. And I just put a few photos there for you to see fish being brought in ashore. Imagine this is a lake, a river, or the ocean, and different vessels in which it comes through. But you also see some contraptions there. That is an example, the middle picture, an example of a cool box, for example, where fish would be put. And often these cool boxes are reused without washing from the previous catch and so on. And there is contamination happening there. And this is being done so that the fish can be transported to a nearby market or further inland. You also see on the far left, maybe on your end, is some fish on the ground in the market. That is also another source of bacterial contamination, often things like salmonella and so on. This is where also other people are stepping on and so on. And you see that the fish is bundled there. So in that bundle, there's a mix of fresh fish and there's also fish that is going off. So there's also cross-contamination happening. But there's also fish challenges happening when fish is, for example, when we try to introduce affordable cold chain. In the bottom right picture where you see, bottom left maybe on your end, you see a hand there. Those are blocks of ice to preserve small indigenous fish species from catch to take them to retail markets further inland. But the quality of the water used to make the ice is not assessed. It's whatever is available. And so the fish could be fresh, could have been handled well, but there's questions about the quality of ice. I think on the next slide, I will specifically focus on an area of fish processing and handling that is a huge source of contamination that is ideally done to ensure that fish gets further inland because of its perishability, but also ends up being a huge source of food-related health risks. You see, for example, at the top there, some birds and fish being dried on a tarpaulin, a plastic mat, and you see birds droppings, for example, happening there. So you can imagine, for example, if those birds are infected with whatever and their droppings are going onto that fish, and that fish is then being consumed after that. On the next one that you see, so there is drying happening. The fish is being dried so that it can go further inland. We want to deliver nutrient-dense foods, but in the process are also delivering unsafe food. So is that food still nutritious when we deliver it in that form? You also see another example of some boiling water there. If you've never been in the fish value chain, I'm sure you're wondering what that is. That is fish being blanched in salty water. And the idea is it is boiled or blanched in that salty water, then dried, and then taken further inland. If you look at the containers that are there, you can already visibly see the questionable, hygiene there that is happening there. The water often is reused across batches severally, and just refilled if it goes down and so on. And often in these processing sites, again, water is an issue, and I guess water is coming up quite a bit, is an issue being used there. I think another one we will relate to for those of us who have been in markets in Southeast Asia or in Sub-Saharan Africa is we often deep fry, whether it's small fish or whatever fish. And the idea is, okay, it frankly tastes good, but also that it lasts long and so on. But often if you look at it, is the oil is reused repeatedly. And that breakdown of that oil that is reused repeatedly also is a source of a food-related health risk. And the final one is that you see on your bottom left or right is a contraption that is used to smoke fish. They are improved kilns, often unaffordable, but this is an example of a normal kiln that will be used to smoke fish so that it can be preserved to move it inland. And often when this firewood is used, there are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons that are produced from the smoke. And therefore those hydrocarbons are, become part of the fish. Remember, there's also microplastic contamination, not just from when they're in the water, but also when the fish is being transported and so on. And this is also being introduced and so on. So there are various points in the processing and preservation that we also promote that could be sources of food-related health risks. And it's important to think about this, especially when we're thinking about solutions. When we propose solutions to address the perishability of nutrient-dense foods, do we think about the possible food safety risks? One big thing with the fish value chain is that when we think about the health risks that I may not have mentioned here in the processing and preservation is that sometimes the risks are not as visible as you see here, and possibly we'll talk about in the next slide. So the health risks, so here you can visibly see maybe the oil has changed color, but we'll go to the next slide, please. Another issue when we are handling is the issue of contamination from chemicals. And you find that, for example, why we are seeing there in the transportation and informal market, your very far left or right picture, you see fish being arranged on a wooden board. Of course, you would ideally want that to be still so that there's no contamination from that wood. But I mean, this is an informal market. There's the issue of water. But what you find also is becoming more and more common in these markets is also the use of chemicals such as formalin to ensure that the fish continues to look fresh. Because what is happening is most of the time the demand from the consumers is to have a fish that looks safe, right? So it looks safe, but it's not really safe. And these are some of the challenges is when you introduce food safety regulation or introduce food safety practices that make the fish improve, but is not necessarily something a consumer would appreciate in terms of what they see. Are they willing to pay a premium for a safer fish, even if it's something they don't see, right? So that's another thing. So you can see also during transportation with fish, we have the issue of bundling. There, the fish is being bundled on a motorbike. There's reduced circulation of air. So the fish, you can be sure some of it is going off and so on. You also see the transportation within crates, and these crates are not necessarily clean. Often lined with polythene bags that are not necessarily washed. So these are also points of introducing bacterial contamination. Next slide, please. So I think the idea for the fish value chain, very similar to the vegetable value chain, is that you see that the chain of risks happens cumulatively. It happens during vendor handling due to poor hygiene, contaminated water, cross-contamination, but also it happens when we are trying to preserve. So often there are cold chain limitations, so there's smoking and so on, and the smoke has, food-related health risks. There's a use of chemicals for preservation. I think an important thing to point out in this value chain is that, especially in these markets where fish is sold or other nutrient-dense foods are sold that are perishable, is that there are limited tools to monitor the food hazards along this value chain. So how do you, in a cost-effective manner, measure this? That is, measure risks that are not necessarily visible to the eye, and then therefore inform the action you take. And also that there a lot of this, for these nutrient-dense foods, there are weak food safety and quality regulations for this. And possibly we'll talk about this when Kebede goes on. But I think I'll hand over to the next presenter where we follow the milk. We'll go to Florence. Welcome, Florence.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Wanjiku. For those that have joined us, we have a plate, and the plate had fish that Wajiko has gone through. It also had vegetables that we had from Milan earlier. So now I take on with the milk, the dairy value chain. So we'll just do a quick reflection in the next couple of slides. We look at the supply of milk, which are the key nodes along the path. Look at the interventions meant to improve milk safety in the informal market, their sustainability, and three-legged stool approach that, if you have been following us, a theory for milk safety, you've heard, and food safety in general, you've heard us talk about the three-legged stool approach to interventions in the informal market. And then lastly, we'll talk about One Health, especially in the context of designing and implementing interventions to improve food safety. Yeah, so here is just a simple, typical value chain for dairy, right from production at the farm level through bulking, transportation and market, then to the final level at the consumption. Of course, at the farm level, we have inputs that are relevant and useful for production. So in terms of the food safety gaps, I think it's good we just start by saying that each of these nodes is quite important. So none of them can be neglected in the efforts to improve milk safety. So for food safety, every stage of the value chain is important. So if you have a first look at the farm level, the production, what are some of the things or issues that would affect the safety of milk that is produced, that leaves this farm? One, of course, is the hygiene and the milk handling. Like, for example, at the milking area, including also the environment around where the milk the milking is done, the disposal of waste, how that waste is used. Is it released also to the farm to potentially also contaminate what Ilana was talking about, the vegetables? Is there a link of that waste to the fish that Wajiko just also told us? Then again, also the feeding, the quality of the feed that gets to the dairy. One key thing is, for example, the aflatoxins. We know that the cow will be exposed to aflatoxins through the feed, and humans will be exposed to aflatoxins through the milk. And one aflatoxin that is relevant, released through milk, is the aflatoxin M1. So to be able to reduce the risk of exposure to humans and also to the animals, then one thing to look at is the feed, the quality of the feed. Again, this is when we go out to do extension on with dairy farmers, we are telling them to consider dairy as a business. So it is not just producing any quantity of milk, but also how much is the milk the farmer able to release to the market, because this has cost, this has income to them. So if there are any disease problems in the farm, of course, the farmer will want to treat the animal. So this takes me to the issue of the use of drugs, for example, antibiotics. And this becomes a concern when the milk that is released for consumption has not passed, that milk has not, the farmer has not observed what we call the withdrawal period. So the milk has, by the time it's sold to the market, released to the public for consumption, it has drunk residues that, depending on the levels, could compromise the health of the consumer. So these are things, just a few of them, that could ultimately affect the quality and the safety of the milk that gets released from the farm. Next slide. Then again, the middle stage there, where we pull together the bulking, transport, and market. I'm using the word bulking because related to the smallholder systems, we see a lot of scattered farms and vendors who are trying to make their living from this business, moving from one farm to another, looking for milk to bulk and take to the market. Depends on where these farms are and also the season. If it's dry season, then they have, maybe they need to go far places, cross different villages and communities to look for milk to take to the market for their own, to get income, but also to provide the consumer with this very important food commodity. So what are some of the issues that would arise here? How the milk is handled by the vendor or the person who is getting the milk from the farmer to the market. The use of non-food grade containers, and we see this a lot because one, the costs that are associated with what the regulator would call a food grade container. Okay. The other one is, as I said earlier, having to move from one place to another to look for milk. How long that takes also could influence the safety of the milk. Somebody mentioned in the chat about adulteration. Probably that is one of the reasons why you voted milk to be sort of the most unsafe of the three commodities that were projected. So is a concern. Is it adulteration with the water? Is it chemicals? Depending on the context, what is it that applies to that particular area? So quite important. And of course, the water, you talk about the water, you talk about the safety and the quality of the water that gets to be added to the milk. It has, of course, the safety issues, but it also has the nutritional impact, because what the child, for example, in this case, is supposed to get doesn't get that nutritionally. And then, of course, the lack of cold storage facilities. If the milk has to be taken off the way from these farms to the market and also at the market, is the infrastructure available to support keeping of this milk at the safe temperatures to preserve the quality and the safety and guarantee consumer safety. Next slide. Then again, of course, at the consumer level, this is a final point, and we all relate to it, either as milk consumers or as people who support others to access milk. One is the source of the milk. Of course, when the milk arrives at the consumption level, there could be some aspects or things that have happened higher in the value chain that even if you try how long to make that milk safe, it will not be possible to make it sales. Think of chemicals that get introduced to the value chain as the milk flows towards the consumer. The cleanliness at this point of milk handling, how you separate that milk from other products. And we borrow this a lot from the World Health Organization's 5 keys to safer food. The cold storage, the cooking is of course we know milking is at the consumer level, the boiling will kill most of the microbial pathogens, but of course it will have no effect on if the bacteria formed toxins for those that do so. So these are things all of which could potentially also influence the milk that gets to be consumed at this final part of the value chain. Next slide. So we just went through some of the gaps which I called concerns. So you asked the question, there could be many depending on the context, but then the question is, which gaps should I focus on? Which gaps, depending on the role that I play as a stakeholder in this value chain? What should I prioritize? What interventions? Where should I intervene to assure the if I call it the safest milk to the consumer, the one that the risk is reduced. So then that brings me to the issue of the need to do prioritization and apply risk-based approaches to food safety. And here I also say that it's important to think of course, when we are going through the different concerns in the notes, we didn't talk about the regulations, the policy, but it's very important we consider this when we are designing interventions that we are hoping they would make impact when out there. And then, of course, the importance of incentives. We all need incentives, and so it is also those that are working on small order value chains and food systems. So here at TIRI, we've been promoting for food safety interventions in the informal market, these three-legged stool approaches. Just three components that are quite key if you want to implement an intervention that you are looking forward to being sustainable and helpful in reducing the burden of foodborne diseases. One, of course, is the main intervention. It could be a training as with associated technologies, okay, which could also be approaches. Then again, also the enabling environment that I was talking about earlier, where the authorities are supportive. I was giving an example the other day to my colleagues in the case where you want the vendors in the market to clean their food items. For example, now going to Ilana's docket on vegetables, you want them to clean the vegetables, but there is no water, you see now, yeah? So we need to provide that water, that enabling environment for them to be able to comply with what they are being told to comply and assure the safety of the food that gets to the consumer. And then, of course, now the incentives, which could be monetary, it could be non-monetary. As I say that we all need incentives, and therefore we also need to support those that we work with, also realize these incentives so that they can also comply and be part of the efforts to provide safe food to the consumers. Next slide. So here is a poll. Just a brief one. In the case of small order dairy, which of the following would require One Health to achieve? So we have milk that is free from drug residues. And we also have a case where milk that, sorry, I have to remove this. Milk that has aflatoxin 1 levels that are within the required limits. So this slide is just to get us introduced to the One Health. So I wanted to hear what you think of this. I just see, okay. Okay, as you vote, just let me say that I don't need to give the right answer to this, but we know what One Health includes. If it's the first option, for example, the drug, ensuring that the milk that is free from these drug residues, which could potentially also link to the problem of antimicrobial resistance. Is it only one sector that is involved, and that's all? With that sector working morning to evening, 24 hours, 7 days in a week, will they ensure us, will they guarantee us that this milk doesn't have any drug residues? Which discipline would be very relevant? Is it only the one discipline, or do we need to think of other disciplines to bring this problem to the levels that are required? The same thing for aflatoxin M1. We know the aflatoxin is a global problem, and where you have, environment has a role to play, agriculture has a role to play, animal health has a role to play. We just saw earlier the slide with that spoiled maize they are going for animal feeding. And we know many others would be required to be able to address this problem. So in that context, do we need One Health? Next slide. Yeah, so this is just for us to see what most you've probably have seen this in many presentations before. This is what the contrapartite gives us, that One Health recognizes that the health of humans, animals, plants, environment are closely linked and interconnected, so you cannot separate them. If you want health, you want to improve the health of humans, also think of the environment, think of the ecosystems, and think of the animal health. And then One Health mobilizes multiple sectors, disciplines, and communities. So you are never enough. You need to work together to be able to ensure that we design and implement interventions that are sustainable, and they will deliver what they are meant to deliver. So alone we can't be enough. The next slide. Yeah, so just as a way of concluding, so we recognize the role that informal markets do play in delivery of milk to consumers. So in addition to production, the farm level, investments should also support markets to provide safe and quality milk. But this doesn't mean that we neglect the roles that each one of us have in ensuring the safety of the milk and of food in general. So for food safety solutions to sustain, again, we need to operationalize One Health. And this one we can't do alone. We can only do if we realize the importance of other sectors and other disciplines. Thank you, and back to you.
Yes, it's my turn now. Thank you, Florence, for going through and giving me the chance now. Thank you also to previous colleagues who just put very interesting ideas about informal food markets or food environment in general. A lot has been said, and then what I just want to emphasize here is about measuring food safety and then associated risk. There is like often saying that if you cannot measure something, you cannot just manage it, whether it is measured qualitatively or quantitatively. These are aspects just I want to really focus here. I just want to really put you like this in context about the WHO Foodborne Disease Burden Epidemiology Reference Group. Thanks to WHO, because it has changed really just a lot about like foodborne disease and food safety at a global level. Estimate like released in 2015 based on 2010 has really changed a lot about foodborne illness, deaths, and then disability adjusted lives by comparing burden across hazard, demographic groups, and the regions. These are really just like really brought a milestone, I can really say, because nowadays food safety is no longer considered as invisible or as a neglected. Because of what? Because of those evidence really positioned food safety as a major global health problem, comparable to major diseases like malaria, like TB, HIV. Those were really just like this measurement, global measurement really put it. But there is open question which remains there. It's at the very global level we have it. What about local situation? You have seen a lot of pictures with vegetables, with fish, with milk, all these kind of things. is like the global level representing very well. Just this local situation is like the question. And then this really could really, this local level exposure could be remain hidden. So for for example, these are really just like some of like very random pictures I took it. From my left, it's really just like raw meat consumption, for example, in Ethiopia, and then sharing like meat like among like people, community during festivities, market situation in Southeast Asia, and then the way it's really just like marketed. All these are really there. You can imagine like how just like things are really just marketed and then consumed everywhere. So it's like the existing measurement system, like in terms of foodborne disease, food safety, covers all these situations. Is like the question we may ask as experts or as a development agent, as a policymaker, as anyone like maybe has a stake in food safety. Actually, food safety is like a business of everybody, because it is like touch each and every one. So for her, they depend on outbreak data, surveillance system, literature, expert opinion. But as you have seen it, the informal markets really suffered from limited surveillance system and the reporting, missing attribution, all these kind of things. If the picture, I just like it, it was like I took it like from southern Ethiopia, in which a herder was like directly getting like milk from a sheep, a goat. And then in that case, you can imagine it's like how just like there is a variation in the formal food system, like in low middle income countries. So the critical limitation here is where is really just burden is known, but where is the risk pathways? This has been mentioned by Florence previously. And the size of the burden, like locally, where is it? And then that really just needs the attention of like many of food safety stakeholders. And then food safety and public health related. Is this something we consume is directly related to public health? Do we have like evidence on those aspects? Is something which we may need to think. Florence has mentioned about like risk assessment and its importance, everything. And then this risk assessment really matters a lot, because it identifies like a priority for food safety. It supports evidence and then guides efficient allocation of, we are like under very limited resources. And then where is like the impact, whether it really brings, instead of only reducing the hazard or the risk. But the very unfortunate part is like there is really challenge, especially in informal food system, where just like we have like limited data, where we have like a very diverse, dynamic informal system, where just like measuring one may not really just applicable to the other one, and then there's surveillance as system. So anything we think of like managing should really be based on a kind of robust risk assessment and then measurement. Unless otherwise, we cannot cover each and everything of like the informal system. So that's something I just can't really measure. I have like a poll here in which I just want to hear about something. If you have a finding to measure only one, that's one food safety surveillance indicator, informal food system or informal food environment, among these, which one you want to choose? Okay, the first vote I see it, the pathogen contamination in food. Next, coming fast. Okay. Interesting. Yes. I see many people are there, and then it's still voting. Quite interesting. Food handling practice, behavior. Yes. Anything more? Yes, yeah. There is no right or wrong thing like from here, but it's like depends on like the situation. And then, but from this, at least like the people are just going for how we really can measure the practices and the behavior, especially this could really hold true very much related to the informal market, because we have seen it like the diversity of food thing or informal system, and then that can be something interesting. Anyway, in the best interest of time, I could really maybe go to like the next slide, and then that case could really see it like how things are really. I could take it a kind of take away as conclusion. As you have seen it from the board, there is nothing really we can see that we need to measure like only this one. We just can combine like this method. We need to really depend on application of various methods. But we need to focus as of this time. We have very fortunate that at the global level, just like good estimate has been done, especially updated this year, like which was released on June 7 in connection with World Food Safety Day, and then which really just like brought like quite a very interesting aspect. For example, the number of illness has been reduced. It means interventions are working like at the global level, and then this is really quite very promising like for food safety professionals and those who are really working in this area. But more evidence is needed still at national level, some national level, local levels, at commodity level, even, unless otherwise we may not really just like quite very effectively manage. So this is like a kind of thing I can really say it, and then we could bring back like this type of thing to during the question and Anders time. But you could now just like for certain time you should come here.
Yeah, so I think the consistent question, again, I go to the comment that was in the chat from Miracle saying, it looks like there's no way out. So many problems, no solutions. I guess that's what he was saying in summary. And maybe to say, as we go to the next slide, and I'll just talk on that slide and open up for Q&A, is what I've picked up from what we said is that there's a need for investment in surveillance, and, surveillance, Kebede, picking up from you that you said there needs to be a combination of surveillance at every point of the value chain. I am betting that in the crowd, people will ask, okay, but when you have limited resources and you're thinking about where do I get the best return for my investment in terms of surveillance, where should I invest in if I'm thinking about the full food system, or I'm thinking about the milk, do I focus in surveilling what is already at the markets? Do I, those kind of things. I think the other thing that we've talked about is the importance of policy and the importance of investment in incentives that are monetary and, money and financial or non-financial incentives for there to be this surveillance happening, but also for solutions to be implemented. But I think for me, when I'm talking about where we place our bets, I've already jumped to, okay, we have surveilled, we know there are issues in specific parts of the value chain or all across, like Ilana well elaborated, and Florence and myself. But then if you are wanting to now advance solutions, the question is, where should I invest? Where will I get the greatest return? And I think the response to that in terms of is thinking about which intervention would have the greatest impact. And what helps you do this is at least two things. The first is a risk assessment. And with the risk assessment, you identify where there are biological, chemical, or physical risks, quantify them, but also identify where, what their link is to health impacts and where you see the greatest health impact happening. That could be one way that the investment or where you place your bets in terms of solution is. I think the other is in terms of doing cost benefit analysis. So you have a specific solution that you're thinking in terms of addressing this food safety health risk. So you're thinking, should I invest in improving the quality of water or building a market, or should I introduce cool boxes or ice technologies in the market? What should I do? cost-benefit analysis would also help, especially a cost-benefit looking at, risk reduction investments that yield the highest net return in terms of improvements in health. But also when you look at those two, you're always looking at the outcome of where are you getting the greatest gain in terms of investment in health. Most of the times, this is the level at which maybe, for example, governments will look at. But remember, these investments need to be adapted by the retailers in the market, by the transporters and so on. And it's important to think about, once you have these, are these scalable? And often what will determine scalability is whatever solutions that you're promoting, there's a third level of looking at, are they affordable? Are they accessible? Are they sustainable? And that really influences whether they are scalable. But it's also important to think about what is overlooked, right? So you have done your cost benefit, you've done your risk benefit assessment, and you've also done looked at if your solutions are scalable or not. Sometimes there are aspects of the value chain that might not necessarily be thought about, or specific solutions that you have advanced but require other things to be available for you to be able to address this. So, for example, if you're thinking of, let's say, I'll go back to the fish that I know, that you say, okay, I'm going to build a modern market, and you're going to build it someplace further inland, but the road leading to that, and this is at macro level, maybe this is a government, the road leading to that market is terrible. That means there's still a lot of time taken from that place to the market. So when you're thinking about your investment, and you've done your cost benefit and so on, and scalability and all, have you thought about what else needs to be thought about for the solution that you're proposing? What has been overlooked? But it's also important to realize when we're advancing solutions, and for us in research, and we're trying to pilot what works, is that an interdisciplinary collaboration is required to identify what parts of the value chain yield the greatest return in terms of health benefits, but also are scalable for those involved in investing in this solution. I'll just summarize there, because I see we only have 15 minutes for a Q&A and a possible wrapping up. I will not present the next slide, but I will pass over to Ilana in case there are any questions and so on, for us to have a Q&A to allow us to have this discussion with the crowd. And like I said before, and I think Joe has posted in the chat, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. And also Ilana will moderate if you want to unmute and ask your question out aloud. Over to you, Ilana.
Okay, thank you, Wanjiku. So I see that we have already one question, and I think it's an excellent question, so I'll start with that. So this is a question by Olutayo Adeyemi, who is asking, are there indicators that countries can integrate into large-scale surveys to understand the scale of the problem and where the gaps are? So I think this is a really good question, because I think it's getting actually at the core issue, that we really do need indicators that we can compare across countries as well. And that, the fact that it's very challenging to actually, I think, measure food safety risks in the informal markets. I think I will pass to Kebede to answer that, maybe to elaborate on that part of it. But maybe what I can say first about some examples of things that might be able to be measured as sort of proxies of food safety risks in large-scale surveys would be, I think, number one, things related to market infrastructure. So what is the percentage of markets with things like safe water available, percentage of markets with hand washing facilities or with shade structures, or with sanitation infrastructure. So I think things that would be indicators of, I guess, proxies of food safety at the market level. And then you could think about some, I suppose you could think about household level indicators in terms of consumer perceptions of food safety, consumer knowledge of food safety and awareness. And then I'll just say at the general food systems level, I think you can think about what are the adoption of things like good agricultural practices. If you think about the farm level for the amaranth example that we gave, what percentage of farmers are using good agricultural practices, So anyway, I'll leave it at that, and I'll let my colleagues answer. Maybe I'll pass to Kebede if you have some elaboration on measurement of food safety in informal markets.
Yes, thank you, Lana. Thank you also, like the one asked it. Normally, regarding like a kind of inclusion of indicators, there could be really just like proposals. For example, African Union has like was developing African Food Safety Index, in which they were just like considering few but important items like regarding to trade, regarding to public health, and then regarding to like other things. So in that case, it is really just if there is like a kind of commitment from government, there is like a potential to like include these kind of very practical to measure, but it still can be very just like informative enough. So there has been initiative like with regard to this to consider like informal market or as Lana said, some kind of proxies for public health even, then that could be really just like good. For example, for as a proxy, African Union, African Union, African Food Safety Index was like considering liver cancer to really just like have some kind of relation to aflatoxin contamination of different food commodity. So there should be like a kind of like more efforts to really just like strengthen, but there have been like already some kind of initiative I could really reflect that way. Yeah, back to you, Lana.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll ask the rest of my colleagues if they have anything to add for this question.
Yeah, Ilana, I am not adding. I'm just contributing to the discussion. I think based on what you're saying, I'm thinking about, for example, adding an indicator to the demographic health surveys. And we know that those already are quite costly. And when you think about, for example, assessing for aflatoxin, even in biological samples, even with food samples, that's quite expensive. And therefore, I think thinking about these national indicators in a way that they can be incorporated in an affordable, I keep bringing up affordability, especially when you think about the regions we are talking with, becomes very important. And I like the idea of proxy indicators, right? So if, for example, thinking about things like in markets that are within an area, access to potable water that can be used to not only, wash hands, but also for, the goods that are there, and possibly those would be some of this. And I guess this is some of the questions that some of the responses that the audience is looking for. Yeah.
Thanks, Wanjiku. And anything else to add for that question? Maybe we can move to the next question since we don't have too much time left. Okay, so let's move to the next question. So this question is telling a story about a friend who did a study in Kisumu on changing from wooden market structures to more hygienic steel alternatives in the context of African leafy vegetables. So the consumers were happy to pay more. They appreciated more hygienic stalls, but oftentimes the intervention is inaccessible to the type of business people that they're targeting. So in this case, often small-scale traders, women trying to earn daily bread. So the question is, even though it leads to safer food and higher revenue once the stall is installed, it's very hard to make that initial investment and switch to those infrastructures. And so the person asking the question is wondering to what extent that form of accessibility is taken into account in interventions and from our experiences. Also, another excellent question, I think that maybe I'll give someone else a chance to answer first. And yeah, I'm not sure if maybe if one of my colleagues wants to answer that. Otherwise, I can also give my opinion. Okay.
Yeah.
Ilana, you can.
Oh, okay. I just could reflect because I have come across like one intervention my institute was like involved in, including also World Vegetable Center, like based in Addis. So it was like introduction of plastic crate, reusable plastic crate, like just for transportation. And then some people tend to really just think of about like what's really just like the cost, initial cost. And then in that case also even not only initial cost, and then also the volume, it really just like can accommodate in one-time transport, because in wooden crates, they can really just load it as much as they can. But this one is not really something they were really doing. So as far as the public health aspects, everything is just justified, and the safety aspect is justified. This kind of needs a kind of commitment from various actors, from government, for example, whether there is a possibility of subsidizing those who are really just accepting it, from international organizations, which will really just like maybe put some kind of initial investment, and then in that case, it can be learned throughout. Because this is something like we should not really consider as that small vendors will remain small vendors forever. Informal markets will remain informal market forever in Africa, in Asia. We need to really just think of like how to step by step improve it toward this really just like full actions. So that is like a kind of thing we need to really consider it. Even if it is quite a very small minor materials provision, all this kind of thing, then that could be part of it. Lawrence was mentioning about this related stool approach in which there should be enabling environments, there should be training and technology, and then just incentives. And that this, if we bring these three together to some extent, then the sustainable improvement can be really there. Just my perspective. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I think I was thinking along the same lines of, and the fact that I think, I'm not sure if I have a good answer besides that. I think that it's very important that we do the implementation research in this area to understand, to focus on the, not only, the effectiveness of these types of market infrastructure interventions, but the cost effectiveness of those interventions, that we need more data on, what are what are the most cost-effective interventions that can actually be sustained, and what are the what are the sustainable financing mechanisms that can be put in place either through policy or government funding to make some of those more, maybe make permanent market infrastructure changes that wouldn't be necessarily paid for by the vendors themselves. So yeah, I think that for me, it's all about thinking about it, as I said in my presentation, from a systems level, about systems level changes that wouldn't come back to the individual farmers or vendors to have to, spend their own money to make those changes, but that it really should be the responsibility of the policymakers to think about what are the most cost-effective changes that they could make for for that. So yeah, I guess maybe my answer is that we need more data and just more policy advocacy in that area. I see Wanjiku, you wanted to say something as well.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add on to, and this has been spurred on by a question online. Maybe I hope I'll answer it. Is I think as we think about this, I think it's also important to think about the trade-offs of investing in, for example, addressing food safety and food-related health risks, because it's possible that there could be unintended consequences on vulnerable population groups. So I'll give an example of, for example, when we work with aquatic foods and decide that maybe what we need to is centralize maybe and have fish preserved as a fish powder and do the centralized production of these so that you're able to ensure safety. So you build these huge industries that maybe government invests in, and so that fish can be delivered to school meal programs. What that does is that, yes, you do get safer aquatic foods further inland because food safety has been controlled, especially at that point of production and handling. But also in that sense, as much as you've introduced a measure that ensures safety, is that it's now more lucrative to then sell these aquatic foods to the centralized place and take it away further inland from the communities that also depend on this nutrient-dense food as their most important and affordable source of, of micronutrients. So also within these decisions around food safety, it's also think about these trade-offs, or when you promote a certain, cooling practice, for example, for the perishable foods, and, there's no subsidy. It's only certain vendors who can either access financing, and often also there'll be men and the women are left out, and so they can be able to preserve and thrive, and the women. So thinking around those, also the trade-offs of who gains, who doesn't, within promoting this, food safety and addressing these risks.
Thanks so much, Wanjiku. And I think that actually I was reading through some of these questions, and I think you're also getting at some of these questions are asking about these sort of winners and losers of each of these interventions. So I think you're also getting at the answers to some of those questions. I think that we have maybe time for one more question. And I'm so sorry to those of you, because there's so many really good questions in the chat, but I'll put the next one that I see, which is which interventions have been most effective worldwide in improving food safety practices among informal food vendors without harming their livelihoods. So maybe if, I don't know who would like to first answer this one. I think Florence hasn't had a chance yet, so maybe I'll pass to you.
Yeah, that's a big one, that maybe we'll need to design a systematic literature review to respond. But for me, I think the basics are, does it work? Is it available? Is it affordable? I think those are simple checks that you can use to define this. I think that's what I can say for now. Otherwise, there's a lot hidden there in that question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Florence. I guess we're almost out of time, but I wonder if any of my colleagues have anything quickly to add on that, and otherwise maybe we can conclude I'll pass to Wanjiku to conclude the session. And I don't know, sorry, I don't know if there's, I hope this is being recorded and maybe the chat will be available, because I think there's a lot of other really good questions that maybe we can somehow continue this discussion after the session with some of the participants in a different format. But that's maybe a question for the ANH people. Okay. So maybe Wanjiku, I'll pass back to you for some closing.
Yes, I think I will not dwell much on the closing. I think we have gone through the various value chain, talked about the risks to think about, but also thought about solutions and what you should, what is possible to invest in or not. I liked the last question around, what has been shown to be the most effective. Maybe that will be the question of our next short webinar and so on to present these results. I did have quite some thoughts on that. But I think the most important message that we left with is greater investment and collaboration are required across sectors. There's a role of government for policies, incentives, information to consumers. There's a role of different actors within the value chain to be able to make this a priority, but they have to be facilitated to do this. I think to end this on my end is to just thank everyone who participated. I think at some point I saw 90 people, quite a bit have dropped off. But to thank you for participating. I hope everyone was able to see each of our contacts in case you would like to have a conversation in future. Thank you very much, and we've really enjoyed this session ourselves.